Hey everyone, David here with your weekly Mouthful of David video. Like usual, we'll start with updates before we get to the video itself. So, if you haven't heard already, we have started a Patreon for the podcast. Patreon is basically a service where you can give monthly donations to people whose stuff you enjoy. What's really helpful is it helps keep our projects, I guess for lack of a better term, going. For us personally at A Mouthful of History, Nick, Cameron, and I don't actually pocket any of the money. It all goes toward our editor, Caroline, who is fantastic, and also just sort of general podcast maintenance and upkeep. Other than that, we recently released our episode about the 1953 coup in Iran, where the US and the British teamed up to overthrow the democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh and basically replace him with a dictatorial Shah. So check that out. And on the horizon, we have an episode, well, really a four-part series about the Algerian War for Independence. So be on the lookout for that. With that being said, today's episode topic is about scapegoating. So, usually with these episodes that I do, these Mouthful of David videos, I'm talking more about history itself as a field and a practice as opposed to actually talking about topics within history, right? So I'm not usually talking about the labor movement or something like that. I'm talking about history itself, how it's put together, how it works, and different ways to think about it. But with the recent increase in hate crimes against Asian American and Pacific Island folks in the United States, I feel like this is a really important subject to talk about: scapegoating. And I'm going to get a little bit specific in a little while about what's going on now, but just to kind of start from a broad place and then get more narrow. Scapegoating is unfortunately something that you see all throughout history in every society, in basically just every place on the earth. And it can be, done against pretty much any vulnerable group. Usually it is ethnic minorities, religious minorities, LGBTQ folks, and just a whole variety of other people who are seen as the other or otherized. And again, it's happened everywhere. I've being a historian and taking different classes, TAing as well these last few years at the world history class that I've TA'd for. You just see it everywhere. One just random example that comes to mind for some reason was for my master's exam for my master's in history. One of the books that I read for my Latin American stack of books was about how in the oil industry in Venezuela, workers were really exploited, but what happened was a lot of powerful people were scapegoating the immigrant workers from China and from the Caribbean. And so it unfortunately was very effective, but there was also worker movements in solidarity. I don't need to get into the details, but just as one of a million examples, you see it in almost every empire, really, which is, of course, relevant for the US. When an empire or kingdom is in crisis, as opposed to trying to figure out what's really going wrong, they often point to a minority or a set of minorities within that empire or kingdom to point the finger at. So, for example, when Buddhism first came to China from India, because Buddhism is actually Indian, something that sometimes we forget about. When China first was introduced to Buddhism during times of crisis, Buddhists were actually heavily scapegoated and persecuted before it became a very mainstream religion there. So it's something you see throughout history, and in the U.S. that's definitely not any different. So many groups in this country have been persecuted, otherized, and used as scapegoats. So, looking at history in the past and looking specifically at anti-Asian scapegoating, You see, for example, the first anti-immigration bill ever passed in the US on a national level was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Whenever you hear someone say, "Oh, immigrants these days, they need to do it the right way. My great grandfather came the right way." Yeah, your great grandfather came during a time where the only criteria for coming to the United States was, "Are you Chinese? No? Okay, cool. Welcome to America." So, side note there, but an always pertinent side note, I feel. And part of why this happened was because of all the violence and prejudice that was being whipped up against Chinese immigrant workers in the United States, specifically in the Western United States. And it's just something that hasn't really stopped since then. A more recent example, not something super, super recent, but something that's happened in some of our lifetimes, was in the 1980s, there was a recession in the United States, and a lot of Americans were understandably upset about that, but was less understandable was getting upset at Japan and really Asian Americans in general here in the US because Japanese auto manufacturers were doing such a good job, which it's kind of hilarious because part of why Japan was doing so well economically was because the US helped rebuild Japan in very generous ways, not out of the kindness of its heart, but to help build up a capitalist Japan to act as a sort of regional counterweight against communist China after World War II. So, Japan is doing well in the rules and parameters and marketplace that the United States set up, but then it's causing this anti-Japanese sentiment, and it results in hate crimes against Asian Americans during this time, most prominently against Vincent Chin, who wasn't even Japanese American, but Chinese American, I believe. And, just goes to show it wouldn't be an ounce more appropriate even if he was Japanese American, but the fact that he wasn't just shows how just ignorant and pointless and misdirected all this hatred is. So we come to the present, unfortunately, corporate global capitalism is the dominant economic ideology of the world right now. China has done a good job of adapting to the rule set, I guess you could say, the terms and conditions that has been created largely by the US during the Cold War and in its aftermath. And so now as the US is starting to kind of go into decline and suffer because we have such an extremely unequal society where a lot of our safety nets and labor protections have just been torn to shreds thanks to runaway capitalism, now we have this going on. We have scapegoating and fear being directed towards Asian Americans and toward other groups as well, and none of it is okay. So, I just felt the need to talk about this. In the link, though, or in the show description, I have a link to an Asian American who wrote an op-ed about this because it's important to listen to API voices on this topic as well. So thanks for listening, everyone. Give that, article a read, and I'll see you next week.